working in a morgue isn't something you just fall into. For me, it was more about necessity than choice. The pay was decent, the hours were odd but flexible, and I didn't have to deal with many living people. It suited me just fine. Or at least, it did at first. The morgue I worked at wasn't particularly large, but it was old, really old. Built sometime in the early 1900s, the place had seen more than its fair share of death. The walls were thick, cold, and always seemed damp, no matter the season. I never knew if that was just my imagination, or if the building itself was somehow breathing, sweating in the quiet moments of the night. My first few months were mostly uneventful. I'd get called in, handle a few bodies, do the paperwork, and go home. But then, things started happening. It was a Thursday, I remember that much. The weather outside was unusually warm for the time of year, but inside the morgue, it was cold as always. Colder than it should have been, honestly, like the chill was coming from deep within the building itself. That night, there was only one body, a man who had died of a heart attack earlier that morning. I'd gone through the usual routine, logging the details, prepping him for autopsy, and then left him in the cold room. The cold room was a sterile, metal-walled chamber where the bodies were kept until they could be transported elsewhere. It was the heart of the morgue, so to speak, and every time I stepped inside, I felt this strange pressure in the air, like the walls themselves were watching me. Anyway, that night, I was sitting at my desk, going through some paperwork, when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so faint that I wasn't even sure I'd heard anything at all. I paused, listening, but there was only silence. I went back to my work, brushing it off. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, unmistakable, a low, drawn-out whisper, like someone was trying to say something just beyond the edge of hearing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Just the rows of metal lockers that held the bodies, all closed, all quiet. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the cold room. My heart was pounding in my chest now, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind or some strange echo from the ventilation system. I'd been working long hours after all, and it wasn't like I hadn't heard stories about people getting spooked in places like this. But still, that whisper, it felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the cold room. The door was heavy and creaked loudly as I pulled it open, the blast of cold air hitting me like a wall. The bodies inside were lined up neatly on their slabs, shrouded in white sheets, just like they should be, but something felt off. The room felt colder than usual, and the air was thick with that same oppressive pressure I'd felt before. I stood there for a moment, just listening, my breath coming out in small clouds of fog. Then I heard it again. A whisper. Clear, unmistakable. It was coming from one of the slabs in the back. I forced myself to walk over, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hands were shaking now, my flashlight beam dancing erratically across the floor. I stopped in front of the slab, my heart pounding in my ears, and pulled back the sheet. The body was still there, cold and lifeless, just as it had been when I left it. But then, as I stared down at the man's face, his eyes, they were open. I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight. The man's eyes had definitely been closed when I'd put him in here. I was sure of it. And yet, now they were wide open, staring blankly up at the ceiling, as if he'd just woken up. I tried to tell myself it was some sort of post-mortem reaction. Maybe his eyelids hadn't been fully shut, and they'd just slipped open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the whisper came again. Louder this time, and this time, I heard what it said. It was just one word, cold. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Bodies didn't whisper, dead men didn't talk. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening, but it was. I stared down at the body, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whisper had been clear, too clear to be my imagination. And those eyes, they weren't just open. They were looking at me. I bolted out of the cold room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead despite the cold. I sat down at my desk, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just heard what I thought I'd heard. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that room, that something was still watching me. For the rest of the night, I didn't go back into the cold room. I finished my paperwork as quickly as I could and left as soon as my shift was over. But even as I walked out of the morgue, I could still feel those eyes on me, could still hear that whisper, faint but insistent. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out the truth. The man who had died of a heart attack, he hadn't been alone when it happened. According to the police report, his wife had been there with him, but instead of calling for help, she'd left him to die, claiming he'd been abusive for years. The coroner said he'd probably been conscious for several minutes after the attack, lying there, unable to move, just waiting for the cold to take him. That whisper, that one word, it still haunts me, cold. Working in the morgue had become an unsettling routine after my first strange experience, but I had tried to move on, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, that whisper, cold, lingered in the back of my thoughts. I figured, or at least hoped, that nothing like that would happen again. But I was wrong. It was about a month after that first incident. Another quiet night shift. I'd gotten used to the eerie stillness of the place by then, but there was always that tension. Like the air was just a little too heavy, like something was waiting. The body I was working with that night was an older woman, somewhere in her late 70s. The coroner's report said she'd passed from natural causes, heart failure. She had no family listed, no next of kin. So her body had been brought in for storage until it could be handled appropriately. To me, it was just another routine case. I placed her body on one of the stainless steel trays in the cold room, slid it into position, and sealed the door. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I remember thinking how still she looked, almost peaceful, in a strange way. The dead didn't bother me. They never had. It was the living, unpredictable and loud that I preferred to avoid. After securing the body, I went back to the main office to finish the paperwork. The cold room door made that familiar, echoing clang as it sealed shut behind me. I sat at my desk, the familiar sound of the old overhead lights humming above me. Everything was calm, just how I liked it. But then, after a few minutes, I heard it. It wasn't a whisper this time. No, it was different. It was a soft, shuffling sound, almost like the faint rustle of fabric, or the sound of feet dragging slowly across the floor. I froze, my pen stopping mid-sentence. The sound was coming from the cold room. My mind immediately went back to that first night, to the man's eyes opening, to the word cold ringing in my ears. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to stay calm. It had to be something simple, something mechanical, a faulty fan, or maybe the air conditioning system kicking in. Anything other than what I feared it might be. I stood up slowly, grabbing my flashlight, even though I didn't need it. The fluorescent lights in the morgue were still on, their cold glow spilling over the sterile floors. But the light was more of a comfort, something to hold on to as I walked toward the cold room. As I reached the door, I paused. The shuffling had stopped, replaced by that suffocating silence that had become all too familiar in this place. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, hesitating. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. I pulled the door open with a loud creak, the cold air hitting me immediately, much colder than it should have been. It was like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged up in front of me as I shone the flashlight around the room. Everything was exactly as it had been. The bodies, still covered in their white sheets, lay motionless on the trays. I counted them, as I always did, 5 bodies, including the old woman I'd just brought in. But as I moved closer, something felt off. It was a strange sensation, like the room itself was alive, watching me. The air was so thick, so cold, it felt like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I walked over to the tray where I had placed the old woman just a few minutes earlier. And that's when I saw it. The tray was empty. At first, I thought I must have made a mistake. Maybe I'd placed her body on a different tray. I quickly checked the others, pulling back the sheets, my breath quickening with each one. But they were all accounted for. Every body was in its place, except for hers. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. She couldn't have just disappeared. I had locked the cold room. No one else had access except me. My rational mind struggled to make sense of it. grasping for any explanation, no matter how ridiculous. Then I saw it. A trail. The cold room floor was always spotless, but there, in the faint light of my flashlight, I saw the unmistakable marks of something being dragged across the floor. It was a thin, barely noticeable trail, like the edge of a sheet or gown had brushed across the ground. I followed it, my heart pounding louder in my ears with each step. The trail led toward the far corner of the cold room, where the older slabs hadn't been used in years. I hesitated for a moment, my hand shaking as I reached out and grabbed the edge of the last slab. With one swift motion, I pulled back the sheet. Nothing. The slab was empty. I let out a shaky breath, my nerves frayed, but the momentary relief was quickly replaced by confusion. If she wasn't here, where was she? I turned around, ready to leave the cold room and report what had happened. Maybe the body had been misplaced. Maybe someone had moved it without telling me. But then I heard it. A low, wet thump. I spun around, my flashlight catching something at the far end of the room. The dragging marks on the floor had deepened, more pronounced now, like something heavy had been moved recently. And in the corner, almost out of sight, I saw a crumpled, pale figure. It was her. The old woman's body lay in the corner, face down, her arms bent at unnatural angles, the sheet from her tray still clinging to her legs. I stood there, frozen, trying to comprehend how she had ended up there. I'd placed her on the tray myself. There was no way she could have moved on her own. I forced myself to step closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. As I approached her, I knelt down, reaching out with trembling fingers to check for any sign of movement, anything that could explain this. But then, just as my hand hovered over her shoulder, her body jerked. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to believe what I was seeing. The old woman's body twisted slowly, her head turning toward me in slow, deliberate movements. Her eyes, milky and lifeless, stared up at me, unblinking. And then, in the silence of the cold room, I heard it. Her voice, soft and hoarse, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside her. "Help me." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of the cold room, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face, my breath ragged and shallow. I quit the job the next day. After the old woman's body moved, I swore I'd never set foot in that morgue again. But a few weeks later, the weight of bills and the lack of other options brought me back. I convinced myself it had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Or maybe there was an explanation I just wasn't seeing. People see things when they're overtired, right? At least that's what I told myself. When I came back, the first few shifts were, thankfully, uneventful. Nothing strange, no whispers, no moving bodies. The building felt cold and empty, like it always had, but at least the air felt lighter, like whatever had haunted those halls had gone dormant, or maybe I had just finally settled into the eerie atmosphere. But then came the night of the third drawer. It was a little after midnight, and the morgue was quieter than usual. We hadn't received any new bodies that evening, so I was mostly catching up on some paperwork. I sat at my desk, occasionally glancing at the clock, hoping the hours would tick by faster. That oppressive silence had settled over the room again, the kind that feels thick, as if the air is alive with something you can't quite see. I'd been working for a few hours when the phone rang. It was the coroner's office. They were sending over a body that had just been brought in by the police. It wasn't anything unusual, just routine procedure. But there was something in the way the dispatcher spoke, a slight hesitation in his voice that put me on edge. The body arrived about half an hour later. It was a man, middle-aged, found dead in his apartment under suspicious circumstances. The police report said it was likely a heart attack, but the coroner wanted a full autopsy just to be sure. I remember the look of the body when they brought it in, pale, gaunt, like all the life had been sucked out of him long before his heart had given out. His eyes were closed, but his face was twisted, almost as if he'd died in the middle of a scream. I've seen a lot of bodies, but something about his expression stuck with me. After logging the details, I wheeled the body into the cold room. As I slid the metal tray into one of the refrigerated drawers, I noticed something strange. The drawer I'd assigned him to, number 3, felt off. The handle was colder than usual, and as I pulled it open, there was a strange resistance, like something was stuck inside. But when I looked, the drawer was empty. I figured it was just a mechanical issue. These old morgue drawers were notorious for getting jammed or sticking, so I didn't think much of it. I placed the body inside, sealed the drawer, and locked the cold room door behind me. But as I was walking back to my desk, I heard something, a soft thud. I stopped in my tracks, listening. The thud came again, this time louder, and it was coming from the cold room. My heart started racing. I turned around slowly, dreading what I might find. I walked back to the cold room, trying to steady my breathing. The door was still closed, the lock secure. But that noise, like something knocking from inside, continued. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was freezing, much colder than usual, and my breath fogged up in front of me. The thudding had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I approached the third drawer, the one where I'd placed the man's body. My fingers hovered over the handle for a moment, and I hesitated. But I couldn't just leave it. I had to know what was making that noise. I pulled the drawer open. The body was still there, lying perfectly still, just as I had left it. But the sheet covering him had shifted, as if someone or something had tugged at it. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the drawer had been stuck because of the sheet, and it had just slipped when I closed it earlier. That had to be it, right? I carefully adjusted the sheet and closed the drawer, but just as I turned to leave, the thudding started again. This time, it was rapid, like something banging against the metal from inside the drawer. I felt my stomach drop. It was impossible. Bodies didn't move, didn't make noise. And yet, here I was, standing in the cold room, listening to a dead man knock from inside his drawer. I stood frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to get out, but my feet refusing to move. The thudding grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside was trying desperately to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I tried to catch my breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm down, trying to tell myself that I was imagining things. It had to be some sort of malfunction, maybe a loose part in the drawer mechanism. Anything but what it seemed to be. But the noise didn't stop. Even through the thick door of the cold room, I could hear it. The banging, the thudding. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting for the noise to start again. But it didn't. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigeration unit. I didn't go back into the cold room that night. I finished my paperwork as quickly as I could and left the morgue, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had I heard? Was it real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me again? The next day, I came back to work, half expecting the third drawer to be broken or jammed. But when I checked, everything was in perfect working order. The body was still there, still cold and lifeless, just as I had left it. But the memory of that night, the sound of the banging, the frantic thudding, it stayed with me. Every time I passed by the cold room, I felt a chill run down my spine, like something was watching me from inside that third drawer, waiting. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was just another strange, unexplainable thing that happens in a place like this. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had been inside that drawer, something that shouldn't have been. After the incident with the third drawer, I couldn't shake the lingering dread that followed me every time I entered the morgue. There was always something off about the place, an almost palpable presence. But after that night, it felt like the atmosphere had grown heavier, darker. I didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to give it life by thinking about it too much. But the truth was, I was afraid. Still, I had bills to pay, and quitting wasn't an option. So I kept going back, night after night, pretending that I hadn't heard that frantic thudding, hadn't seen a body where it shouldn't have been. And for a while, things were quiet. Then came the night I saw the man in the mirror. It was a typical shift. I'd just finished logging in a new body, a car accident victim, if I remember right, and had moved on to some paperwork. The lights buzzed overhead, casting their pale glow across the room. The usual quiet settled over me like a blanket, and I found a kind of uneasy peace in the monotony of the work. There's a bathroom in the back of the morgue, just a small, dingy room with a cracked mirror and flickering light. I usually avoided it unless I had to, preferring to hold out until my shift ended, but on this particular night, I couldn't wait any longer. I pushed open the door, flicked on the light, and stepped inside. The mirror, as always, was streaked and cloudy, the kind of grime that no amount of cleaning could ever fully remove. I washed my hands, my eyes half closed from exhaustion, but then something in the reflection caught my attention. At first I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but then I looked closer, and my blood ran cold. In the mirror, over my shoulder, I saw him. A man. He stood at the far end of the room, near the entrance to the cold storage area. His face was pale, almost ashen, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink deep into his skull. He wore a hospital gown, the kind we put on the bodies, but it was torn and stained with something dark, something that looked an awful lot like blood. I spun around, expecting to see him standing there, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. He was still there, staring at me, but in reality, there was nothing behind me. It didn't make sense. My mind couldn't process what was happening. I backed away from the sink, my eyes locked on the reflection. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching, his dead eyes fixed on me. I scrambled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it wasn't right. It wasn't possible. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was overtired, that it had to be some kind of trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the image of that man, standing so still, so unnervingly quiet. The rest of the night dragged on in a haze of anxiety. Every time I passed by the bathroom door, I felt that same cold dread creep up my spine. I didn't dare go back inside. I finished my shift as quickly as I could and left the morgue, practically running to my car. But the next night, the man was there again. This time, I wasn't even in the bathroom. I was in the hallway, walking past one of the large wall-mounted mirrors that hung near the entrance to the cold room. And there he was, standing in the reflection, just as he had been the night before. His pale face, those dark, sunken eyes, that same torn hospital gown stained with something I didn't want to think about. But just like before, when I turned around, there was nothing there. My hands trembled as I backed away from the mirror, my pulse quickening. I couldn't escape the feeling that he was watching me, always there, just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I rushed through the rest of my shift, my eyes constantly darting toward every reflective surface, afraid I'd see him again. The days turned into weeks, and every time I saw my reflection, he was there. It didn't matter where I was in the morgue, the bathroom, the hallway, even the small reflective surfaces on the machines. He would always be standing just behind me, silent, unmoving. At first I tried to ignore it, to push through the fear. I even covered the mirrors, hoping that if I couldn't see him, he wouldn't be there. But that didn't help. He was always there, lurking in the corners of my vision, a pale, ghostly figure that never left. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who or what this man was. I went through the records, searching for anyone who might have fit his description. It took hours, but eventually I found him. His name was Robert Hall. He died a few months ago, brought into the morgue after succumbing to a terminal illness. I remembered the case vaguely. It hadn't stood out at the time. Just another body in the long line of people who passed through the cold steel doors. But as I read through the file, a cold chill settled over me. Robert Hall had been cremated. His body had never been stored in the cold room. There was no reason for him to be haunting the morgue. No connection to the place, no unfinished business that I could think of. I didn't understand. Why was he here? Why was he watching me? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't get rid of him, couldn't stop seeing him. No matter what I did, he was always there, a ghost in the mirror, following me wherever I went. Then came the night everything changed. I was in the cold room, checking the drawers before the end of my shift. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigeration units. I was tired, barely paying attention, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there he was. Not in the mirror this time, but standing in the middle of the cold room. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. He just stared at me, his hollow eyes boring into mine. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat, but no matter how far I moved, he was still there, his figure looming larger, more real than it had ever been. I stumbled out of the cold room, slamming the door behind me, but when I looked back through the small window, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him. But even now, whenever I pass a mirror, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me. I left the morgue not long after that, unable to handle the constant fear, the constant watching. But the thing is, I'm still not sure if I escaped him. After the night I saw the man from the mirror standing in the cold room, I knew it was time for me to leave the morgue for good. My nerves were frayed, and I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Those sunken eyes, the pale skin, the tattered hospital gown. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting, even though I hadn't seen him since that last encounter. It was my last shift before I planned to hand in my notice. I was ready to walk away and never look back. The shift had been quiet, too quiet, honestly. There had been no new bodies that night, no calls from the coroner's office, nothing. Just me, alone with the dead. The air felt heavy, more so than usual, as if the room itself was pressing down on me. There was a stillness that seemed unnatural, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. Every small sound, the click of a clock, the hum of the refrigeration unit, felt like it was magnified. My nerves were on edge, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the noise. A soft, distant tapping sound coming from somewhere deep in the building. It wasn't the normal groan of pipes or the buzz of the lights. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and faintly echoing through the halls. I tried to ignore it at first, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was knocking on the walls, trying to get my attention. My stomach dropped. I'd heard that knocking before, the night of the third drawer. The noise seemed to be coming from the cold room. My heart raced as I approached the door. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't just leave it. If I ignored it, I knew I'd be haunted by the thought of what was waiting in there. I pushed open the door, my hands trembling. The cold room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the emergency light above the door. The air felt thicker than usual, colder. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered. I stood there, frozen, scanning the room for anything out of place. All the drawers were closed, the bodies undisturbed. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard something else, something faint, almost imperceptible. It was a whisper. At first, I thought it was the sound of the refrigeration unit, but as I listened closer, I could make out words. The voice was low and breathy, coming from somewhere deep within the room. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the whispering stopped, replaced by a sudden, loud bang. The drawer, the third drawer, flew open. The body inside, the one I had logged just days before, lay there, unmoving, covered by the white sheet. But something about the way it was lying there didn't feel right. The sheet had slipped, revealing part of the body's arm, and it was twisted in a way that was unnatural, almost like it had been positioned deliberately. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I approached the drawer. I didn't want to get closer, but I couldn't stop myself. My breath fogged in the cold air, and every step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I couldn't escape. I reached for the sheet, my fingers shaking, and slowly pulled it back. The body's face was twisted, not in pain, but in something far worse, fear. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and staring at the ceiling, but they weren't just lifeless, they seemed aware, like he had seen something terrible before he died, something that had stayed with him even in death. I stepped back, horrified, but that's when I felt it. A hand. Cold fingers wrapped around my wrist, squeezing tightly. I looked down in shock, and there, emerging from the open drawer, was a pale, bony hand. I stumbled back, pulling my arm free, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. But it didn't stop there. The body in the drawer sat up, not slowly or groggily like a living person waking from sleep, but in a sharp, unnatural movement, its limbs jerking like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Its head lolled to the side, those dead, fearful eyes locking onto mine. I scrambled backward, tripping over the metal trays behind me. My back hit the cold wall of the room as the body stepped out of the drawer. Its movements were wrong, disjointed, like it was being pulled by something invisible, something that wasn't human. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up in fear. The body, no, the thing wearing the body, started moving toward me. Its mouth opened, and the same whispering I had heard before filled the room, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't words, though. It was like a summoning, a call to something dark and ancient. I stumbled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest, and bolted for the door. Behind me, I could hear the thing's footsteps shuffling and dragging across the cold floor. I didn't dare look back. I ran through the halls, the echo of that whisper chasing me, growing louder and louder. I burst through the main door of the morgue, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, everything was still, silent. Then the whispering stopped. I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. I couldn't go back. I knew I was done, that whatever was haunting the morgue had won. That was my last night at the morgue. I left my resignation on the desk the next morning and never looked back. Alright, so this happened about, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago? It still feels like yesterday, though. I swear I've never experienced anything like it, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still off. You know? Anyway, let me try and explain. So, I've had this dog Max for almost 5 years. He's a German Shepherd, big guy, super loyal. You know the type, follows you around everywhere, loves to fetch, always wagging his tail when you walk through the door. He's pretty much my best friend. I live alone, so it's just me and Max most of the time. It was like that for years, no problems. Then, one day, Max started acting weird. I know dogs can be strange sometimes, but this was different. It started small, like he'd just stare at me. Not in that cute, I want attention kind of way, but more like, I don't know how to describe it, like he was studying me. His eyes didn't look like his anymore. They were cold, almost calculating. It made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. Dogs can be moody, right? The first big thing I noticed was with his food. Normally, I'd fill his bowl in the morning before work, and by the time I got home, it'd be empty, and he'd be begging for more. But one day, I come home, and the food's still there, untouched. Max is just sitting by the door, staring at me with those strange eyes. I tried coaxing him, but he wouldn't eat. Just kept watching me. I figured he might be sick, so I took him to the vet. They did all the usual checks, but nothing came up. Healthy as ever, they said. So I went home, thinking it was just a phase or something. That's when things started getting really bizarre. One night I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, and Max was lying on the floor by my feet, as usual. But then, I heard this noise, like a faint clicking sound, coming from behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing on his hind legs, just staring at the wall. I'm not kidding. He was standing like a human. My heart nearly stopped. Max? What the hell are you doing? I said, but he didn't move. He just stood there for a few seconds more, then dropped back down on all fours like nothing happened. I laughed it off, thinking maybe he was stretching or something, but deep down, it freaked me out. I'd never seen him do that before. A couple of days later, I noticed Max started following me more closely than usual. Not in the playful way he used to, where he'd trot along next to me. No, it was quieter, more deliberate. I'd leave a room, and when I turned around, he'd be standing in the doorway, just watching me. No barking, no wagging tail, just silent. It was like he was tracking me. I started feeling paranoid, like I was living with something that wasn't Max anymore. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m. or so. You know how sometimes you just feel like something's wrong? I had that feeling. I sat up in bed, and there, at the foot of my bed, was Max. He was standing, again on his hind legs, and he was looking at me. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just looking, his head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to understand something. And then, his mouth opened. Not in a panting, dog-like way, but slow, deliberate, like he was about to speak. I swear, I felt the blood drain from my face. I could barely move. I didn't know what to do. I was just staring back at him, frozen. And then, as if nothing weird was happening, he just dropped back down to all fours and walked out of the room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. After that night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the door to my bedroom closed, but I could hear him outside, pacing back and forth. The weird thing was, it wasn't like normal dog pacing. It was slow, methodical, like he was thinking. It was driving me insane. I started avoiding him, locking myself in my room or the bathroom for hours just to get away from him. I couldn't look him in the eyes anymore. It was like something had taken over him. Then one night, the final straw. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat dinner, but I couldn't focus. My mind was racing, thinking about Max and all the weird things he'd been doing. I hadn't seen him for most of the day, which was strange in itself, but I was relieved for the break. Suddenly I heard this scraping sound coming from the hallway. I froze. It was slow at first, but then it got louder, more frantic. I stood up, my heart racing, and slowly walked toward the sound. And there he was, Max, standing on his hind legs again, but this time he had one of my shoes in his front paws, holding it like a person. He was trying to put his paw inside the shoe, like he was trying to wear it. I don't know what came over me, but I screamed at him, "Max, stop!" He dropped the shoe and just stared at me, those cold, calculating eyes locked onto mine. But this time, it was different. There was something in his expression, something almost human. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like he was trying to communicate, trying to be human. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house. I drove around for hours, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what was happening. By the time I got back, it was nearly dawn. I walked through the door, half expecting to find Max waiting for me, but the house was quiet, too quiet. I called his name, but there was no response. I checked every room, but he was gone. His bed was empty, his leash still hanging by the door. I even checked the backyard, thinking maybe he had somehow gotten out, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had just disappeared. I haven't seen Max since that night. I've asked around the neighborhood, put up posters, even called the local shelters, but no one has seen him. Part of me is relieved, honestly. I know that sounds awful, but after everything that happened, I don't know if I could have kept living with him in the house. The weirdest part? A few days after he disappeared, I found his favorite toy, the one he always carried around with him, sitting on my kitchen table. I didn't put it there. I don't know how it got there, but it was like he left it as a final message, a reminder that he had been there, that he wasn't just a dog anymore. I still don't know what happened to Max. Sometimes I think maybe he wasn't really a dog, that maybe he was something else, pretending to be a dog all these years. Or maybe something took him over, something that was trying to learn how to be human. I don't know. All I know is that whatever it wasn't Max anymore. Now, every night before I go to bed, I double-check the locks on my doors and windows. I can't help but feel like he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. And honestly, I don't know what I'd do if he did. So yeah, that's my story. I'm not really sure what to make of it, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. You can believe me or not, but I swear, there was something wrong with Max. Something unnatural, and I'm scared it's still out there. I'm just a regular guy, you know? I've got a pretty normal life, a decent job, and a wife who's, well, let's just say she's a bit different. Her name is Sarah. We've been married for a couple of years, and while she can be quirky and unpredictable, I love her for that. We met in college, and there was something about her that just drew me in. She has this wild spirit, always up for an adventure, and sometimes I feel like I'm the steady one in our relationship. Anyway, things started to change a few months after we moved into our new house. It's a nice little place, old, with lots of character, creaky floors, and all that. But for some reason, ever since we moved in, Sarah has been acting a bit off. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the move or adjusting to a new place. You know how it is. But then, the little things started to pile up. For one, she began talking about strange dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find her sitting up in bed, staring blankly at the wall. When I'd ask her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and say she didn't remember anything. It made me uneasy, but I didn't think much of it at the time. There was this one night, though, that really sticks out in my mind. I remember it clearly because I had a long day at work, and was looking forward to some quality time with her. We'd settled down on the couch, watching a movie, and everything felt normal. But when I looked over, I could see this distant look in her eyes, like she wasn't really there with me. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, nudging her gently. She blinked and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, but I could tell something was off. Later that night, we went to bed, and I fell asleep pretty quickly. But then, at around 3 in the morning, I woke up. The room was dark and silent, and I could feel something was off. I turned to Sarah's side of the bed, and she wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat. "Sarah?" I called softly, trying not to panic. I thought maybe she'd gone to the bathroom or something, so I got up and checked the bathroom. Empty. I walked through the house, turning on lights as I went. The living room was empty, and the kitchen was quiet. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't like her to just disappear like that. I started to feel this tightness in my chest, like a weight was pressing down on me. "Sarah," I called again, louder this time. Nothing. It was eerie. The house felt too quiet, too still. I walked towards the back door, and that's when I noticed it was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I rushed outside, calling her name into the night, but all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. The moonlight illuminated the backyard, casting long shadows, and I felt completely exposed. I searched everywhere, behind the shed, near the fence, but there was no sign of her. Panic began to set in. I couldn't just stand there. I had to find her. I grabbed my phone and called her, but it went straight to voicemail. I paced back and forth, trying to think of what to do. Should I call the police? My mind was racing, and I felt like I was losing it. Then, as I was about to head back inside, I heard something. It was a soft sound, almost like whispering. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise seemed to be coming from the woods behind our house. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt this pull, like something was urging me to go closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the trees, following the sound. The moon was my only light, and the shadows danced around me as I walked deeper into the woods. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like multiple voices, all murmuring together. As I pressed on, I felt the chill in the air. The woods were dense, and the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. I didn't know how far I'd gone when I finally stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was an old, gnarled tree, twisted and knotted. That's when I saw her. Sarah was standing there, completely still, her back to me. She was just staring at the tree, her hair hanging down like a curtain. I called her name again, relief flooding through me. "Sarah, there you are." But when she turned around, my blood ran cold. Her expression was blank. There was no recognition in her eyes, no warmth. It was like she was a completely different person. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, just kept staring at me, her lips slightly parted like she was about to say something but couldn't find the words. "Come on, let's get back inside," I urged, stepping closer. But she didn't move. Instead, she pointed at the tree. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. I looked at the tree, and for a moment I thought I could hear it too. The whispering. It was like the tree was alive, breathing, its bark twisted like a face. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused and scared. "They're calling me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sarah, we need to go home," I insisted, reaching for her arm. But as soon as I touched her, she flinched and stepped back. "Don't!" she shouted suddenly, her voice echoing through the clearing. It startled me, and I took a step back. "Why not?" I asked, my heart racing. "They're waiting," she said, her eyes glazed over. "I can't leave." I didn't understand. What was happening to her? I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Snap out of it. It's me. It's your husband." But she just looked through me, her gaze distant, like she was lost in a trance. Panic gripped me again. I turned to look at the tree, and that's when I noticed something moving in the shadows. Figures. They were standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, hidden among the trees. I squinted, trying to make them out, but they melted into the darkness. "Sarah, please, we need to go," I begged, trying to pull her away from the tree. But she resisted, her eyes darting back and forth as if she were struggling against something I couldn't see. "Don't take me away," she cried, and I felt my heart shatter. "Take you away? From what? From who?" I yelled, desperation clawing at me. "The whispers," she said, her voice trembling. "They want me." I was terrified. I had to get her out of there. I yanked her arm, and finally, she came with me. But it was like I was dragging her from a dream. We stumbled back through the woods, her feet dragging behind me. The whispering grew louder, echoing in my ears, and I could feel a cold breeze swirling around us. When we finally reached the edge of the woods, I turned to look back, and those figures were still there, watching us. I felt a surge of fear, and I pulled her into the safety of our yard. "We're home now," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But Sarah just stood there, trembling. I led her inside, locking the door behind us. I turned to face her, searching for any sign of my wife, the woman I loved. But all I saw was confusion. "Sarah, please talk to me," I pleaded. "What happened out there?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't remember." I was at a loss. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly as if I could protect her from whatever had happened. But she felt distant, like she was somewhere far away. The next few weeks were a blur. Sarah didn't seem like herself. She was quiet, withdrawn, and I could see that something had changed in her. The warmth that had always been there was gone, replaced by this cold distance. I tried to talk to her, but every time I brought up that night, she'd shake her head and say she couldn't remember anything. I even went back to the woods a few times, hoping to find answers. But every time I felt that same cold whispering, like the trees were warning me to stay away. I never saw those figures again, but I knew they were still out there, lurking in the shadows. One night, I woke up to find Sarah sitting up in bed again, just like before. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart racing. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just feel strange." "Just stay with me," I said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away, staring at the wall. "Do you hear them?" she asked, her voice distant again. I felt the panic rising in my chest. "No, I don't hear anything. Please, just come back to bed." But she just shook her head. "They're calling me. I have to go." "Go where?" I shouted, frustration boiling over. "You're scaring me." She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. I can't help it." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, someone who I thought could help. I explained everything, and he agreed to come over. When he arrived, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Sarah, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "My friend is here to help. We're going to figure this out together." But Sarah didn't respond. She just sat there, staring blankly at the wall, lost in her own world. My friend walked over, trying to engage her, but she didn't seem to react. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling helpless. "It's like she's not even here anymore." Suddenly, Sarah jolted upright, her eyes wide. "They're coming!" she screamed, and I felt a rush of dread wash over me. "What do you mean?" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "They're going to take me," she cried. And in that moment, it felt like the world was falling apart. My friend and I exchanged a worried glance, but before we could say anything, she bolted from the room. I chased after her, but by the time I reached the living room, she was already at the door, flinging it open and running outside into the night. "Sarah, no!" I yelled, sprinting after her. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, filling my head with a chaotic chorus. I followed her into the woods, fear gripping me as I pushed through the branches. "Sarah!" I called, but the darkness swallowed my voice. I caught up to her in that clearing again, and she was standing by the tree, her back turned to me. "Sarah!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. But as soon as I touched her, she turned to face me, and what I saw froze me in place. Her eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion. "They're here," she said, her voice cold and distant. "No, no, we have to go." I pleaded, but she wouldn't budge, and then I heard them. The figures emerged from the shadows surrounding us, their whispers growing louder. "Join us," they seemed to say, their voices echoing through the trees. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. "Sarah, fight it. It's not real." But she just stood there, a small smile creeping onto her face as she reached out toward them. "I have to go with them," she said, her voice almost serene. "No," I shouted, pulling her back, but it felt like I was losing her, like she was slipping away through my fingers. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let them take her. I grabbed her and turned to run, dragging her back through the trees. The whispering grew louder, like they were angry, following us, trying to pull her back. I burst into the yard, dragging Sarah with me. "You're safe. You're safe," I shouted, and somehow she snapped back to reality, looking around with confusion. What happened?" she asked. And I felt a glimmer of hope. "You were lost, but I found you. We have to get inside," I urged, pulling her toward the house. But as we reached the door, I heard the whispers again, this time right behind me. I turned to look, and those figures were there, just beyond the yard, watching us with those empty eyes. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight. We collapsed on the floor, panting, trying to catch our breath. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, but I won't let them take you," I said, holding her tightly. For weeks after that night, we didn't talk much about what had happened. I tried to keep her safe, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. The darkness was creeping back in, and every now and then, I'd catch her staring off into space again, that distant look returning to her eyes. I kept hoping it was just a phase, but I knew deep down that something was wrong. It was like the woods were calling to her, and I was terrified of what would happen if they ever got her again. I spent sleepless nights worrying, trying to find ways to help her, but every time I brought it up, she'd dismiss it, claiming it was just a bad dream. But I could see it in her eyes. The fear, the uncertainty. Then one night, I woke up to find her gone again. I panicked, jumping out of bed and searching the house. My heart raced as I called her name, but there was no answer. I rushed to the back door, and to my horror, it was ajar again. "Sarah!" I shouted, racing outside. The moon was bright, illuminating the path through the woods. I could feel the whispers in the air, tugging at my mind. I forced myself to follow the sound, praying I wouldn't find her at that cursed tree again. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. Finally, I stumbled into the clearing. There she was, standing by the tree again, her back to me. "Sarah?" I yelled, rushing toward her. But before I could reach her, she turned, and what I saw made my heart drop. Her eyes were vacant, and she had that same eerie smile. "They're waiting," she said, her voice almost melodic. "No, come back to me." I screamed, but it felt like I was shouting into the void. In that moment, I knew I had to act fast. I rushed forward, grabbing her shoulders, shaking her. "Listen to me. You're stronger than this. You're my wife." For a brief second, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. "I have to go," she murmured, and the whispering intensified around us. I couldn't let her go. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. "You're not going anywhere. I love you," I cried, my voice cracking. And then I felt it. A force pushing against me, trying to pull her away. It was like the very air was charged with electricity. I fought against it, holding her tighter, feeling her struggle against me. "Fight it, Sarah, fight for us," I shouted, but the whispers grew deafening. Suddenly she went rigid in my arms, and I thought I was going to lose her. "No," I screamed, feeling tears streaming down my face. "Don't leave me." And then as quickly as it started, it stopped. The whispers faded, and Sarah collapsed against me, her eyes fluttering shut. I held her tightly, my heart pounding. "I'm here. I'm right here," I whispered, and slowly she came back to herself. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You were lost, but I found you," I said, holding her close. From that day on, we decided to leave the house. We packed our things and moved to a different town, far away from those woods. It was a fresh start, and I hoped it would help us heal. Sarah slowly returned to herself, and over time, we managed to talk about what happened that night. She didn't remember much, but she felt that dark presence linger, like a shadow waiting for the right moment to return. Now we live in a small apartment, and while things are better, there are still nights when I wake up in a panic, checking to see if she's beside me. Sometimes I catch her staring off into space, and I wonder if those whispers are still calling to her. But we've made it this far, and I'm determined to keep her safe. I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to take her away. was late, probably around 11:30 or so. I'd stayed late at work to finish up some last-minute things, and by the time I was ready to head home, the city had grown quiet, almost unnervingly so. You know that feeling when the streets, usually filled with people and noise, suddenly seem too still? Like the emptiness is pressing in, and every shadow feels a little too long? That's how it felt that night, as I clutched my bag tighter and quickened my pace. Just unsettling, like something was off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just being a woman alone at that hour, but the silence felt heavier than usual. Anyway, I was walking the usual route back to my apartment. I don't live far from the office, maybe a 15-minute walk, and most nights it feels pretty safe. But as I passed this small park, I saw a man sitting on a bench. He looked, well, homeless. Ragged clothes, dirty jacket, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. I remember thinking it was sad to see someone out in the cold, but I didn't think much of it. That is, until I got closer. "Miss?" he called out to me as I passed. His voice sounded weak, like he was desperate. "Could you help me? Please?" I froze for a second, debating whether or not to stop. I mean, I knew better than to engage with strangers that late at night, especially when I was alone. But something in his voice, this tone of desperation, made me hesitate. I glanced around. The street was empty, and the few cars that passed by didn't stop. He wasn't threatening or anything, just sad. So I stopped, keeping a little distance between us. "Are you okay?" I asked, already feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickling up. I didn't like how quiet it was. Too quiet. He stood up slowly, and I could see him a little better now. He was tall, maybe mid-50s, with this haggard, sunken face. His eyes, God, his eyes were the most unsettling part. They looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. But there was something else, a sharpness, like he was sizing me up. I need help with something," he said, wringing his hands. "It's just around the corner, a few steps away, please." Now, this is where I should have walked away. Every instinct was telling me to just keep going, to say I couldn't help and get the hell out of there. But he looked so pitiful, standing there with his hands trembling. I don't know what I was thinking, but against my better judgment I nodded. "Okay," I said hesitantly, "but I can't stay long." He smiled at me then, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was crooked, almost forced, like he was trying too hard to seem friendly. Something about it made my stomach turn, but by that point I'd already agreed to help, and turning back seemed rude. Stupid, I know. He led me down the street, just a few feet away, toward this narrow alley I'd never really noticed before. It was tucked between two old buildings, dark and filthy, the kind of place you wouldn't want to be, even in broad daylight. The moment we stepped into it, a cold wave of dread washed over me. The alley was narrow, with high walls on both sides, and the streetlights barely reached into it. I stopped in my tracks. "What do you need help with?" I asked, my voice shakier than I intended. My heart was already starting to race, and I couldn't help but glance behind me, hoping I wasn't as alone as I felt. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just kept walking, moving deeper into the shadows. I stayed put, realizing that something wasn't right. The air in the alley felt thick, oppressive. I could smell the dampness of old trash and mildew, and the sound of distant traffic seemed to fade as if we'd stepped into some kind of bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. That's when he turned back toward me, and I could see his face clearly under the flickering light from a nearby window. His smile was gone. His expression had hardened, and his eyes, those tired, sharp eyes, locked onto mine in a way that sent a chill down my spine. "Come closer," he said, his voice lower now, more commanding than before. I took a step back. "What do you need help with?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice steady. My mind was racing, and the fear was building in my chest. Something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, without warning, he lunged toward me, grabbing my wrist with a grip so strong it felt like it could crush bone. I gasped, instinctively trying to pull away, but his fingers dug in, holding me tight. "What are you?" "Let go of me," I shouted, panic overtaking me. His face twisted into a cruel, almost predatory grin. "You shouldn't have followed me," he hissed, his breath hot and sour against my face. "Now you're mine." For a split second, I was frozen, the shock of it all hitting me at once. But then adrenaline kicked in, and I yanked my arm as hard as I could, twisting my body to break free. His grip loosened just enough for me to slip out of his grasp, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. My feet barely touched the ground as I bolted out of the alley, the sound of his footsteps thudding behind me. He was chasing me, and I could hear his heavy breathing getting closer. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get away, to reach the street, to find someone, anyone who could help. As I burst onto the main road, I spotted a couple walking arm in arm, laughing softly to each other as they strolled down the sidewalk. Without thinking, I darted toward them, throwing myself behind them and gasping for breath. "Help me!" I cried out, my voice shaking with fear. "He's after me!" The couple turned around, startled, and the man immediately stepped in front of me, shielding me from the alley. The woman looked confused but concerned as she asked, "What's going on?" Before I could explain, the homeless man emerged from the shadows of the alley, his face twisted in fury. He stopped just at the edge, standing half hidden in the darkness, glaring at us. His eyes were locked onto mine, filled with this horrible, seething anger. It was like he was daring me to come back, but there was something else too, something almost hungry in the way he stared at me. The man with the couple stepped forward, his voice firm. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, clearly not intimidated. For a long moment, the homeless man didn't move. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he stared at us. Then, without a word, he turned and slunk back into the alley, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, shaking, unable to process what had just happened. The woman put her hand on my shoulder, her voice soft and calming. "Are you okay? Do you want us to call someone?" I nodded, barely able to speak. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the police. The couple stayed with me, keeping an eye on the alley in case the man came back. When the police finally arrived, I explained everything, every detail I could remember. But by the time they searched the alley, the man was long gone. They took my statement, asked if I was hurt. Thankfully I wasn't, physically at least, and promised to keep an eye on the area. But the truth is, they never found him. He just vanished into the night, like a shadow. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those wild, angry eyes staring at me from the darkness. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't broken free, if that couple hadn't been there. The thought alone made me sick to my stomach. Even now, months later, I still can't walk home at night without feeling that familiar twinge of fear. Every shadow feels like it's watching me, and every time I pass by that park, I quicken my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. So yeah, I've learned my lesson. No matter how desperate or harmless someone seems, you can never really know what's going on in their head. You just can't. And sometimes it's better to be rude, to walk away, than to let yourself get pulled into the darkness. Because not everyone comes back from it.